The night Augusta Fletcher's last lantern shattered against the floorboards of her little house on the edge of Cassidy Creek, she did not cry, though she had every reason in the world to do so. She stood in the sudden dark, glass crunching beneath her worn boots, and listened to the wind pressing its hands against the thin walls of her home, as if it intended to come inside whether she invited it or not. It was the autumn of 1878, and the territory of Kansas was not known for its mercy toward women who lived alone. She had known that when she came here. She had known it with every bone in her body, and she had come anyway, because there was nothing left for her in the East and everything left to be discovered in the West, even if discovering it cost her something. Augusta was 24 years old and stubborn in the particular way that people become when they have survived enough losses to stop fearing new ones. She had come to Cassidy Creek 8 months ago with 2 trunks, a sewing kit that had belonged to her mother, and a letter of employment from a woman named Harriet Doone, who ran the town's only school out of a building that also served as the church on Sundays. The pay was not generous. The accommodations were not generous. The land itself was not generous. But Augusta had looked out at the flat, wind-combed prairie the first morning she arrived and felt something in her chest open up like a window someone had forgotten to close for years, and she had decided, quietly and firmly, that this was where she intended to stay. The lantern had been the last one. She had dropped it trying to carry too many things at once, coming in from the cold with her arms full of the papers she had spent the evening grading at the schoolhouse. The oil had spread across the floor and the flame had guttered out before anything could catch, which was a mercy. But the lantern was destroyed and the darkness was total, and Augusta stood in it with her papers scattered around her feet and thought, with the calm practicality that defined her, that she would need to go to Hatcher's general store in the morning. She did not think about Reuben Conroy. She had no reason to think about him. He was a ranch hand who worked for a man named Dale Pritchard out on the eastern pasture land, and she had spoken to him exactly twice. The first time was when he had held the door of the post office open for her without looking at her, apparently absorbed in a letter he was reading. The second time was when she had asked him, in the mercantile, whether the sugar on the 3rd shelf was the coarser kind or the finer, and he had looked at her for a long moment before saying that he honestly could not tell the difference and she ought to ask old Hatcher himself. That was the extent of their acquaintance, and yet she remembered both occasions with a peculiar clarity that she had not examined too closely, because examining things too closely was how a woman alone on the frontier got herself into trouble. Reuben Conroy was 28 years old and worked with his hands and his back, and occasionally his heart in ways he would never have admitted to anyone who asked. He was not a man who talked much. He was not a man who explained himself, not because he was arrogant but because the explaining always seemed to come out wrong, seemed to flatten the thing he was trying to say into something smaller and less true than what he actually felt. He had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 children, and had come west at 19 to find something he had not been able to name until recently. He thought now it might have been space. Room enough to be whatever he was going to be without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on him from every direction. He had been in Cassidy Creek for 3 years, and he knew most everyone in the town at least well enough to nod to, which was how you knew people in a place like this. But he had noticed Augusta Fletcher in the way you notice a specific bird in a field full of common ones, not because she was louder or more colorful, but because there was something in the way she moved through the world that seemed deliberate in a way most people's movements were not. Like she had made a decision to be exactly where she was and had not second-guessed it since. He had watched her across the street, talking to Harriet Doone outside the schoolhouse one afternoon, laughing at something the older woman said, her head tipped back and the autumn light catching the loose pieces of her dark hair that the wind kept pulling free from its pins. He had watched her and then looked away quickly because looking was the sort of thing that led to wanting, and wanting led to all manner of complication that he was not sure he was equipped to handle. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. But he would not know it for a while yet. The morning after the lantern broke, Augusta wrapped her coat around herself and walked the half-mile into town along the dirt road that was already hard with the first thin crust of autumn cold. The sky was the color of pewter and smelled like rain that had not yet decided to fall. The town of Cassidy Creek was not large, but it was not nothing either, which was more than you could say for some of the settlements scattered across the Kansas plains. It had a main street with a hotel, a saloon, the general store, a barber shop that also served as the dentist's office on Tuesdays, the post office, a livery stable, and the combined schoolhouse and church building where Augusta spent most of her waking hours. There were perhaps 300 people in the town and the surrounding farms and ranches, and most of them knew each other's business whether they wanted to or not. Augusta pushed open the door to Hatcher's general store and breathed in the smell of it, which was one of her favorite smells in the world. A layered, complex scent of coffee and leather and sawdust and dried herbs, and the faint sweet rot of apples in a barrel near the door. Old Ezra Hatcher was behind the counter, a man of about 60 with a thick white beard, and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had decided long ago that hurrying accomplished nothing worth accomplishing. "Morning, Miss Fletcher," he said, without looking up from the ledger he was writing in. "Good morning, Mr. Hatcher," she said. She moved through the store with the ease of someone who had spent enough time in a place to know its geography. She picked up a tin of tea, a spool of brown thread, and a bag of dried beans, setting them on the counter as she went. Then she stood in front of the shelf where the lanterns were kept and studied them with the careful attention of a woman making a purchase she could not easily repeat. There were 3 kinds. The cheapest were small and light, the kind made of thin tin that dented if you looked at them wrong. The middle kind were brass-fitted and sturdier, with better wicks and wider bases that made them harder to knock over. The most expensive were the kind you saw in hotels and wealthy homes, with etched glass and decorative work that Augusta found beautiful and entirely impractical for her purposes. She was reaching for the middle kind when the door opened behind her and brought in a gust of cold air, and as it turned out, Reuben Conroy. He was dressed the way he always was when she had seen him: dark canvas trousers, a heavy flannel shirt, a coat that had seen several winters and showed it. He wore his hat pulled down in the way that men who worked outside wore their hats, not for style but for function, against the wind and the sun, and whatever else the sky chose to throw at them. He was tall enough that he had to angle his head slightly coming through the doorway, and there was a quiet, unhurried quality to the way he moved that she had noticed before without fully registering. He stopped when he saw her. It was not an awkward stopping, not the kind that meant something was wrong. It was the kind that meant he was recalibrating, deciding something. "Miss Fletcher," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Conroy," she said, because she had made it her business to know people's names even when she did not know them well. It was a habit left over from teaching. You learned names first. Everything else came after. He moved to the far side of the store, presumably to get whatever he had come for, and Augusta turned back to the lanterns. She lifted the middle one, testing its weight, checking the joint where the base met the body of it. It was solid. It would do. "That one's good," Reuben said from somewhere to her left. She had not heard him approach, and she startled, which she did not like doing in front of people. "I'm sorry," she said. "That one," he said, nodding at the lantern in her hands. "Good brass fittings. Base is weighted right so it won't tip. Hatcher orders them from the same supplier as the Pritchard Ranch." He paused. "They hold up." She looked at him. He was not looking at her exactly, more at the lantern, the way you might look at something you were actually thinking about rather than something you were using as an excuse to talk. "Thank you," she said. "That's helpful." "Your old one break?" he asked. "I dropped it," she said, "last night coming in from the schoolhouse." He nodded slowly. Something shifted in his expression, some small internal thing she could not quite name. "Those walks can be hard in the dark," he said. "The road's not well lit on the south end." "No," she agreed, "it's not." He seemed to want to say something else, and then decided against it. and instead he moved away toward the counter where Hatcher was waiting with the patience of a man who had seen every possible permutation of human conversation happen in this store, and was no longer interested in hurrying any of them. Augusta brought the lantern to the counter along with her other items. She counted her money carefully, the way she always did, not because she was miserly but because she understood exactly how much there was, and she could not afford to miscount. Reuben bought a length of rope and a jar of axle grease and a box of matches, the kind of purchase that told you exactly what kind of life a man was living, and he said nothing further to her, and she said nothing further to him, and they left the store within 30 seconds of each other heading in opposite directions, which was exactly what she had expected. She walked home along the same road she had come in on, the lantern tucked under her arm, and the wind pushed at her back as if it was trying to help. She did not think about the way he had looked at the lantern in her hands instead of at her, as if looking at her directly required more preparation than he currently had. She grated papers that afternoon and made soup on the small cast iron stove in her kitchen, and read for an hour before bed, lighting the new lantern and sitting close to it at the table where the light was best. The flame was steady and clean. He had been right about the brass fittings. The next 3 weeks passed in the ordinary way that time passes when you are too busy to track it carefully. Augusta taught her students, ranging from 6 to 14 in age, the full span of what a frontier schoolteacher was expected to know: reading, writing, arithmetic, a little history, a little geography, and the management of a room full of children who would rather be outside. She was good at it. She was patient in the way that came from genuine interest rather than forced composure, and her students mostly liked her, which made the work easier and harder in equal measure, because she cared about them, and caring about things in a landscape that could turn violent or cold or simply indifferent without warning was always a calculated risk. She saw Reuben Conroy twice during those 3 weeks. Once across the street, loading something into the back of a wagon, and once in the post office where they nodded to each other, and she pretended to be deeply interested in a notice posted on the wall about the availability of winter hay. She was not sure why she pretended. It was not a habit she usually had. The first real conversation they had, the one that mattered, happened because of the weather and because of the Henderson boy. Thomas Henderson was 9 years old and one of Augusta's more troublesome students, not in the way that meant he was bad, but in the way that meant he was extremely smart and needed more of her attention than she could always give. He lived with his family on a small farm a mile and a half east of the schoolhouse, and one Thursday afternoon in late October, he did not go straight home after school. He went instead to investigate a red-tailed hawk he had seen land near the creek, which was the kind of thing Thomas did, and he did not come home before the storm hit. The storm came in fast, as prairie storms do, moving across the flat land with nothing to slow it down, and by the time Augusta looked up from her desk and saw the sky through the schoolhouse window, it had gone from pewter to the particular dark green-gray that meant hail or worse. She had sent the last of her students home an hour ago. She was alone, grading by the light of the lantern she now kept at the schoolhouse during the day. She thought of Thomas Henderson immediately with the specific lurch of anxiety that teachers feel for children they know are not quite safe yet. She was pulling on her coat when the door opened and Reuben Conroy came in, ducking under the low lintel, his hat dark with rain that had already started. She stopped. He stopped. "I was coming to tell you," he said, and then corrected himself. "To see if you'd heard, the Henderson boy, he's not home." "I know," she said. "I was just going." He looked at her coat, her boots, the direction of the window where the sky was now doing something truly alarming. "You were going out in this." "He's 9 years old," she said, as if that explained everything, which in her estimation it did. Something moved across his face that she would later identify as the specific combination of exasperation and admiration that he seemed to experience exclusively in relation to her. "I know how old he is," he said. "I'm going too, Just wasn't sure if you knew." They went out together into the storm, which was not yet at its worst but was building with intent. The rain was cold and horizontal, and the wind was loud enough that they had to lean toward each other to communicate. Reuben knew the territory better than she did, and he led without making a production of it, moving through the drainage paths near the creek with the efficiency of someone who had worked this land long enough to know where it hid its dangers. They found Thomas Henderson 15 minutes later, huddled under a cutbank of the creek, where he had apparently had the good sense to shelter when the storm broke. He was wet and scared and trying hard not to show either. He was holding a tail feather from the red-tailed hawk, which he had apparently retrieved before the weather turned, and he held it up when he saw Augusta, as if this explained and justified everything. "That is a very good feather," Augusta said, because she understood Thomas, and she pulled him up and wrapped her coat half around him for the walk back even though it barely helped, and she was already soaked to the skin herself. Reuben said very little on the walk back. He walked on the windward side of them, which she noticed, and which blocked some of the worst of the gusts, and he carried Thomas for the last quarter-mile when the boy's legs gave out from cold and tiredness, the child asleep against his shoulder with the hawk feather still clutched in one small fist. Augusta walked beside them through the rain and thought, with a startling clarity that she immediately tried to put aside, that this was one of the kindest things she had ever seen a person do without announcing that they were doing it. They got Thomas to the schoolhouse, which was the nearest shelter, and built up the stove and wrapped the boy in the woolen blanket Augusta kept folded on the shelf above her desk, and sent Reuben's horse, which he had tied outside, to carry word to the Henderson farm that the boy was safe. Or rather, Reuben sent it. Augusta was not entirely sure how he accomplished this without the horse also having a message to deliver, but apparently the horse knowing the way was sufficient, and it was, because Frank Henderson appeared at the schoolhouse door within the hour. During the time between Thomas falling asleep and Frank Henderson's arrival, Augusta and Reuben sat on opposite sides of the stove and dried out in the slow way that wet things dry near heat, which is to say, gradually and with a certain amount of steaming. Augusta had put water on for coffee, or what passed for it, the dark bitter kind that schoolhouses kept on hand because teachers required it to survive. She poured 2 cups and handed him one. He took it with both hands, warming them. "Thank you," she said, "not for the coffee, he knew that. He's a good kid," Reuben said, "gets into things, but he knows how to think." "He does," she agreed. "He wants to be a naturalist, he told me in September." Reuben looked at her. "Did you tell him he could?" "I told him he would need to study very hard and write very well and that he would probably have a difficult time of it, but that people had done it before him." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "I don't believe in telling children their dreams are impossible. I believe in telling them the truth about the cost." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good approach," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her think he was not just talking about Thomas Henderson. The storm blew itself out and Frank Henderson came and took his son home, and they stood in the schoolhouse doorway watching the Henderson wagon disappear into the now clearing dark. And then Reuben said he would walk her home before he rode back to the Pritchard ranch. She started to say she was fine, that it was not that far, and then she looked at the dark road and thought of the broken lantern which she was now carrying the new one from, and she said simply, "All right." They walked. The rain had left the road muddy and the air smelled clean in that particular afterstorm way, washed and cold and somehow expectant. She carried the lantern and it threw their shadows long and paired behind them. They did not talk much, but the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that did not need filling. When they reached her door he stopped and she stopped, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She thanked him again for Thomas. He said he was glad the boy was all right. He turned to go. She went inside. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment after the door closed, holding the lantern, and then she set it on the table and sat down and looked at it for a while. The following Sunday, the town held its regular church service in the schoolhouse, which required Augusta to spend Saturday afternoon moving the student benches into rows and setting up the space for Reverend Aldous Crane, who was a decent man with a tendency towards sermons that ran 20 minutes longer than anyone found comfortable. Augusta did not mind the work. She liked the ritual of it, the transformation of the space from one kind of community gathering place to another. She was carrying a bench single-handedly when Reuben appeared in the doorway. He had clearly come from the ranch, still wearing his working clothes, though he had cleaned up some, the dust knocked off his hat and his hands washed. "Let me," he said, and took the other end of the bench without asking. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, rearranging the space. He was good help, efficient, attentive to where she wanted things, not the kind of person who helped by doing it his own way and calling it a favor. When they were done, she poured him water from the pitcher she kept on her desk, and he drank it and looked around at the transformed room. "Do you come to the service?" she asked. "Most Sundays," he said. I set it up and then I feel obliged to stay," she said. There was a dryness in her voice that she had not intended, and he caught it, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Crane goes long," he said. "He does," she agreed. "He's a kind man." "He is. His sermons just need editing." She laughed, a genuine one, and he looked at her when she laughed in a way that she felt but did not comment on. "Where did you teach before Cassidy Creek?" he asked. It was the first personal question he had asked her directly, and she recognized it as what it was, a door being opened, carefully, to see if she would come through. "Philadelphia," she said. "Before that, a smaller school in Ohio. I grew up in Ohio." She paused. "You came from Missouri, I heard." "You hear things," he said without any offense. "Small towns," she said. "True enough." He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as something he did when he was thinking about saying something he was not sure about. "What brought you to Kansas, if you don't mind my asking?" She considered the question. She had answered it before for other people, with a version that was true but not complete. She was not sure why she gave him a more complete one. "My mother died 2 years ago," she said, "and after that there was nothing keeping me anywhere particular. And I had always wanted to come west. I had read about it." She looked out the window at the flat line of the horizon. "The books don't quite get it right. It's harder than they make it sound, and stranger and more beautiful." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right." "What about you?" she asked. "Needed space," he said. "Missouri was getting crowded, or I was, hard to know which." A pause. "My father was a difficult man, good in some ways, hard in others. I needed room to figure out what I thought without him telling me what I thought first." It was more than she had expected him to say, and she received it carefully, the way you receive something given carefully. "Did it work?" she asked. "Mostly," he said, "still working on some of it." He stood up. "I should get back, early start tomorrow." She nodded. He moved toward the door and then turned back, which she had started to expect from him, those half pauses, those almost departures. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "In Cassidy Creek, it's a better place with a good teacher." She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he put his hat on and left. She stood in the rearranged schoolroom for a long time after, in the particular stillness of a person who has understood something she has been pretending not to understand. October deepened into November, and the weather turned with a seriousness that the plains took on in late autumn, the sky lowering and the cold coming in not dramatically but steadily, the way a tide comes in, inch by inch, until you look up and find yourself standing in something much deeper than you remembered it being. Augusta pulled her winter coat out of the trunk where it had been sitting since April and was glad she had brought it, even though it was heavier than she liked and made her shoulders tired when she wore it all day. The town had a social gathering the first Saturday of November, as it did every year, in the hotel's meeting room. It was part harvest celebration and part community survival mechanism, a way of reminding everyone that they were not alone out here on the flat land, that there were other people within walking distance who would come if you called and would pass the bread and dance to the fiddle and laugh at stories about how bad last winter had been. Augusta went because it was expected, and because she liked people when they were in the right kind of mood, which social gatherings usually produced. She wore her blue dress, the better one, which she had not worn since she left Philadelphia and which still fit because she had not changed that much, only rearranged somewhat. She put her hair up properly, using all the pins, and then took half of them back out because she was in Kansas and not a ballroom. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand and decided she looked like what she was, a schoolteacher at a Western frontier social, which was exactly fine. The meeting room of the hotel was warm and crowded and smelled of beeswax candles, and the particular combination of wool and boot leather and soap that large gatherings of working people produced. There was a fiddle player named Otis Birch who was only sometimes in tune but always in earnest, and a caller for the dancing who was the blacksmith Merv Applewood, which surprised no one who knew Merv. There was food on a long table along one wall, corn bread and roasted meats and pickled vegetables and pies, everything brought by the various households of the community as their contribution. Augusta ate and talked and danced once with Frank Henderson, who was a good dancer, and once with Reverend Crane, who was not, and she was taking a moment by the far wall with a cup of cider when she saw Reuben Conroy come through the door. He was cleaned up in the way that men who worked outside could clean up when they chose to, which was different from city cleaned, but was its own kind of good. He had combed his hair, and his coat was the good one, the dark one that made his shoulders look very broad. He stood in the doorway for a moment doing what he always did, recalibrating, taking stock, and then he saw her and something in his posture changed in a small way that she could not precisely describe except that he straightened slightly. He made his way across the room. She watched him do it. "Evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. "You look well," he said, and immediately looked as if he was uncertain whether that had been the right thing to say. "Thank you," she said, deciding to let him off easily. "You look considerably less soaked than the last time I saw you." He exhaled a short laugh. "Yeah, that was a rough one." They stood together at the edge of the room and watched the dancing for a while, and talked in the way you talk at social gatherings when the music is a little loud, and the room is a little warm, which is to say, with more ease than you might manage in a quiet room because the noise and movement around you create a kind of permission. She told him about the progress her older students were making with arithmetic, and he told her about the work they were doing at the Pritchard Ranch, preparing for winter, the particular kind of labor that involved before the ground froze and the cattle needed to be managed for cold weather. "Do you like it?" she asked. "Ranch work." He thought about this honestly, which she appreciated. "I'm good at it," he said finally. "Whether that's the same as liking it, I'm still working out." "What would you do," she said, "if you could do anything?" He looked at her for a moment as if the question surprised him, not its content but the fact that she had asked it as a genuine question and not a rhetorical one. "I'd have land of my own," he said. "Not a big ranch, just enough. Run some cattle, maybe some horses. Build something that was mine." "You're saving for it," she guessed. 3 years at it," he said. "Getting there," she nodded. "You'll get there," she said. And she said it with such simple certainty that he looked at her with something in his face she did not let herself read too directly. Otis Birch started a waltz, imperfect but recognizable, and Merv Applewood called for partners, and Reuben Conroy turned to her with an expression that she could only describe as determined, as if he had made a decision and was executing it before he could change his mind. "Would you dance?" he asked. She put down her cider cup. "I would," she said. He was a better dancer than she had expected, not formally trained but naturally capable, with a sense of rhythm and a steadiness that made following easy. He held her with the appropriate distance, but his hand at her back was warm through the thin wool of her dress, and she was very aware of it, in the way you are aware of a specific warmth in a cold season. They moved through the other couples without talking for a full minute, and then he said, quietly, "I'm glad you came tonight." "Were you worried I wouldn't?" she asked. "I didn't know," he said. "You're hard to predict." She tilted her head. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, and there was nothing complicated about the way he said it. "No, it really isn't." The dance ended, and they stood at the edge of the floor, and neither of them immediately moved away from the other, which was its own kind of statement in a room where everyone could see everything. Harriet Doone found Augusta the next morning outside the schoolhouse and gave her a very comprehensive look that contained several paragraphs of information without a single word. And Augusta said firmly, "Don't start, Harriet," and Harriet said, "I haven't said a thing," in the tone of someone who was saying everything. The weeks that followed had a different quality, not dramatically different. Nothing had been said, no declaration made, no agreement reached. But the space between Augusta Fletcher and Reuben Conroy had shifted in the way that the air shifts before rain, a change in pressure, in the quality of what was between them. They found reasons to be in proximity that were not quite accidental and not quite deliberate, which is the particular middle ground of two people who are interested in each other but moving carefully. The way you move across ground you are not entirely sure is solid. He stopped by the schoolhouse one afternoon with a split of firewood she had not asked for, explaining, without much elaboration, that Harriet Doone had mentioned the woodpile was getting low. Whether Harriet had actually said this, Augusta could not verify, but she thanked him and he stacked the wood near the door and then sat on the steps for a moment while she stood in the doorway, and they talked about whether the following winter would be worse than the last, which everyone in Cassidy Creek was currently debating, and about a family that had come through town the previous week heading further west, and about a book she was reading about the exploration of the territories that she thought he might like. "I'm not much of a reader," he said. "You might like this one," she said. "It's mostly geography and observation, less storytelling." She paused. "Or so it claims. The author has a tendency toward drama." "All right," he said. "I'll try it if you can spare it." She brought it out and he took it with both hands, looking at the cover, and she noticed that his hands were very careful with it. She liked that. The town of Cassidy Creek had its share of the tensions that ran through every frontier settlement in Kansas in the late 1870s, and Augusta was not ignorant of them, even if her position as schoolteacher meant she walked a careful line. There were the disputes between the ranchers and the small farmers over water rights and fencing. There was the persistent question of the Cheyenne land to the west, land that had been theirs and was being pressed from all sides by settlers, which was a wrong that Augusta held clearly in her mind, even when there was nothing she personally could do about it, and even when the community around her preferred not to examine it too directly. There were the men who came through town looking for work or trouble or both, and the railroad company's representatives who kept appearing and making claims about what the territory was going to look like in 5 years, which served the railroad company's interests considerably more than anyone else's. Reuben had opinions about most of these things, she discovered. Quiet opinions, not the kind he broadcast, but the kind that were actually considered, that had been arrived at through observation and thought rather than inherited and kept like furniture. He thought the water disputes were being handled badly and that someone was going to get hurt before they were settled. He thought the railroad's promises were worth about half what they were offered at. And on the question of the Cheyenne land, he said something one afternoon that surprised her. They were sitting outside the schoolhouse in the thin November sun, the last of the warm days before winter fully committed to itself, eating the lunch she had packed, which she had started sharing with him on the days he was in town because it seemed efficient and because she liked having someone to eat with. He had been talking about the land to the west, describing the landscape, and then he stopped and said, "I know it's not my business to say, but it wasn't right what happened. What's still happening?" The land was theirs. It had been for longer than anyone's counting. She looked at him. "No," she agreed quietly. "It wasn't right." "There's not a lot of people in this town who will say that out loud," he said. "No," she said, "but thinking it quietly doesn't do much good either." He nodded. "What do you do when you can't fix the big wrong?" "You do what you can in the small place you're in," she said. "You teach the children to think clearly. You say the true thing when you can. You don't pretend the wrong didn't happen just because looking at it is uncomfortable." She pulled at a piece of grass. "It's not enough, but it's something." He was quiet for a moment. "You're something," he said, and then he looked away at the horizon as if he had not said it, or was offering her the option to pretend he hadn't. She did not pretend. She looked at the side of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the way he squinted slightly at the distance, and she thought, "I am in considerable trouble." What she said was, "I think that's the nicest thing you've said to me." "I'm working on saying more of them," he said, still looking at the horizon. "Take your time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." November gave way to December, and the cold arrived in earnest and life contracted. The way life on the frontier always contracted in winter, pulling inward toward warmth and shelter, and the management of daily survival. Augusta's students came to school wrapped in layers, and she kept the stove burning hot all day, and they did their reading huddled near it, which was not ideal for posture but was very good for warmth. She walked to and from the schoolhouse each day in the blue-gray early dark of winter, carrying her lantern, and the lantern was good, the brass fitting solid and the flame steady in all but the worst winds. She thought about Reuben Conroy more than she would have admitted to anyone, including Harriet Doone, who was already watching the situation with an interest that was entirely unconcealed. She thought about the way he talked about things, slowly and with attention, as if words were something you handled carefully rather than threw around. She thought about the way he had carried Thomas Henderson in from the storm without making it a story. She thought about the way he had said, "I'm glad you stayed." She was not, she told herself firmly, going to make anything of it until something was actually there to make something of. She was a practical woman. She did not build castles out of kindness and a waltz. She waited to see what was real. What was real arrived on a Wednesday evening in the second week of December, in an indirect way, as real things often do. Augusta was on her way home from the schoolhouse, later than usual because she had stayed to help young Clara Finch with a reading passage the girl was struggling with, and the evening had gone full dark, and the cold had a particular bite to it that made the light of her lantern feel small and insufficient. She was walking the road home, the dirt now frozen hard beneath her boots, when she heard voices from the alley beside Haverson's Hardware, which was closed at this hour and dark. The voices were two men, one of whom sounded younger and frightened, and she stopped walking and listened. The younger voice was Jimmy Whitcomb, who was 16 and worked afternoons at the livery stable. The other voice she did not recognize. The tone of it was clear enough. Augusta did not hesitate. She stepped into the alley mouth and held up her lantern so the light fell into the space. "Jimmy," she said in her schoolteacher voice, which was not loud but was extremely authoritative. "There you are. Your father is looking for you." Jimmy Whitcomb was not looking at her with confusion at this patent fiction. He was looking at her with desperate relief. The other man turned. He was large and smelled of whiskey, and had the particular look of someone who felt that the arrival of an interruption in his plans was an insult. "This ain't your business, lady," he said. "I'm the schoolteacher," Augusta said, with the perfect calm of someone who has decided that the worst that can happen is already happening, and therefore there is no point in fear. "And this boy works for my neighbor. So it is my business. Jimmy, come along." Jimmy came along. He came along very quickly, and they walked back out onto the main street and did not look back until they had put a sufficient distance between themselves and the alley, and then Jimmy exhaled so hard he nearly bent double. "Thank you," he managed. "Miss Fletcher, I go directly home," she said. "Don't take the alleys tonight." He went. She stood on the main street with her lantern and realized that her hands, which had been perfectly steady all through it, were now shaking very slightly, which was the way her body registered things, always after the fact rather than during. She became aware, standing there, of Reuben Conroy walking toward her from the direction of the saloon, which he frequented occasionally for the same reason most working men did, because it was warm and there was company. He saw her standing still in the street and his pace quickened slightly. "You all right?" he said, reaching her. "Fine," she said. And then, because he was looking at her with the focused attention of someone who was not going to accept fine as a complete answer, there was a situation in the alley. Jimmy Whitcomb, A man who was bothering him. I walked in with the lantern and it resolved." He stared at her for a moment. "You walked into an alley at night with a drunk man in it." "I walked into the mouth of an alley," she said, "with good lighting and a loud voice. It was fine." "Augusta," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both knew it and neither of them addressed it directly, but it landed between them like something important that had fallen and broken open. "Are you?" "Did he?" "No," she said. "I'm all right. Jimmy is all right." It resolved quickly. She looked at him. "I'm not made of glass, Reuben." "I know that," he said with an emphasis that suggested he had perhaps never been more aware of anything. "I know, He stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. He looked at her standing there in the cold in the lamplight with her chin up and her hands not quite steady, and something moved in his face like weather. "I'll walk you home," he said. She could have said she was fine. She could have said she did not need an escort. She could have said any number of true things. Instead she said, "All right." They walked. The town was quiet around them, the cold keeping most people indoors, the snow not yet fallen but close enough to smell. Their boots crunched on the frozen road and the lantern swung slightly in her hand and threw their shadows along beside them. "I was afraid," she admitted when they were clear of the main street. She said it because she was a person who told the truth even when it was unflattering to herself. "My hands shook after." "That's not a bad thing," he said. "It means you have good sense. You were afraid and you went in anyway." "Someone had to," she said. "Someone always has to," he said. "Doesn't mean it isn't hard." She looked at him, walking beside her in the dark, steady and present, and she thought, "This is a person I would like to have beside me for a very long time." They reached her door. She turned to face him. The lantern light caught the planes of his face, the serious, careful face of a man who was thinking about something and choosing his words with the attention he gave everything. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask," she said. "Would you be willing to let me court you?" he said. "Properly." "Not," he gestured at the accumulated weeks of conversations and firewood and dances. "Not just what we've been doing, which I have appreciated, but formally. If that's something you'd want." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold dark, this man who brought her firewood and read her books carefully and said true things slowly and stood on the windward side in storms without making a fuss about it. "Yes," she said. "I would want that." He exhaled, a long breath in the cold air. "Good," he said. "All right. Good." "Good," she agreed, and there was warmth in the word that had nothing to do with temperature. He stayed at her door for another minute, neither of them quite ready to end this particular moment, and then he said he had to get back to the ranch, and she said yes, of course, and he touched the brim of his hat in his way and turned to go, and then he turned back one more time. "I meant what I said," he said. "You're something, Augusta Fletcher." She held the lantern between them in the cold, its light small but steady. "Good night, Reuben," she said. He grinned, actually grinned, which was different from the corner-of-the-mouth thing she had seen before, and it changed his face in a way that hit her somewhere between her ribs. Then he went. She went inside and stood in her kitchen and put the lantern on the table and sat down in the chair and put her face in her hands, not in distress, but in the particular overwhelmed pleasure of a thing that you have wanted and were not sure of receiving and have now been given. Courting on the Kansas frontier in 1878 looked different from courting in Philadelphia, and not much like it looked in the novels Augusta had read as a younger woman, which she had always suspected were slightly fictional even about the parts they claimed were ordinary. There were no calling cards left in silver trays, no chaperones in drawing rooms, no formal introductions in parlors. What there was, instead, was time. Time spent together in the ordinary life of the place, which was itself extraordinary when you were spending it with the right person. Reuben came to the schoolhouse on Saturday mornings when he was not needed at the ranch, and they would walk together along the creek path or through the flat farmland to the east of town, where the sky felt biggest, talking about everything and nothing in the particular way of two people who are learning each other, and finding, with a pleasure that keeps surprising them, that they like what they find. He brought her things, not showy things, not the kind of things that were meant to impress, but practical things chosen with attention. A good pair of work gloves in her size when he noticed hers were thin, a small jar of good honey from a man at the ranch who kept bees, a branch of dried winterberries that he had clearly picked himself, and then seemed uncertain about once he was holding it, which she took from him with such direct pleasure that the uncertainty resolved itself. She made him dinner once a week, on Thursday evenings, when she had more time to cook something properly. It was nothing fancy. The frontier did not offer fancy, but she was a good cook in the honest sense, and she took pleasure in feeding people well. And he ate with the appreciation of a man who spent most of his time eating whatever the ranch cook produced, which was fuel more than food. They sat across from each other at her small table and talked until the candle burned low, and he would stand up and put on his coat and hat and thank her, and she would walk him to the door, and they would stand there for a moment in the small transition between inside and out. He kissed her for the first time in January, standing at her door in the white winter cold, snow finally fallen and the world turned clean and quiet with it. It was not an impulsive kiss but a deliberate one, the kind that has been thought about and decided on, and he put one hand very gently along her face before he did it as if he was asking a question and waiting for the answer, and she turned into his hand in the answer, and then he kissed her, and it was warm and careful and completely right, the way things are when they have been approached honestly from the beginning. When he pulled back, he looked at her for a moment in the snowlight, her cheeks cold and her eyes bright, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said, and she thought the same, and she went inside with the snow still cold on her coat and stood in the middle of her kitchen and smiled until her face ached with it. Harriet Doone said, when she found out, finally, with a conviction that suggested she had been waiting for it for considerably longer than Augusta had been aware of it herself. February was hard. The way February in Kansas was always hard. The cold settled deep and the wind with nothing between it and you but distance. Augusta kept the school running on days when the weather allowed and canceled on days when it did not, using those days to catch up on the reading and the planning and the letter writing that always accumulated. She wrote to a cousin in Ohio about the winter and about teaching and, obliquely, about a man named Reuben, and received back a letter full of pointed questions that made her laugh. Reuben was mostly tied to the ranch in February, the cold weather work being demanding in ways that limited his time in town, but he came when he could, and on the days he could not he sometimes sent notes with other ranch hands who were making the trip, short notes written in his careful handwriting, not florid or long, just present. He told her once, sitting at her table in the weak February sunlight, that he was not good at words on paper. "You're better than you think," she said, and showed him one of the notes which said, "Thinking about the creek conversation we had last week. You were right about the ice patterns. Looked at it again this morning. Going to be a good spring." And below that just, "That's good," she said. "You said exactly what you meant." "That's all I was trying to do," he said. "That's what good writing is," she told him. He looked at her. "You really believe that?" "I really do," she said. "The elaborate kind is just dressing. What matters is whether you said the true thing." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did sometimes now in the quiet of her kitchen, and held it without requiring anything of the gesture. "You make everything sound simpler than it is," he said. "No," she said. "I make it sound exactly as complicated as it is, and then I refuse to apologize for the complication." She turned her hand so it was holding his back. "There's a difference." The spring came, as springs do on the prairie, with an urgency that seemed to be making up for lost time. The grass came back fast and green, the creeks ran high with snowmelt, and the town of Cassidy Creek breathed out the collective held breath of a community that had made it through another winter. New families arrived, as they did every spring, following the railroads and the promises and whatever drove people westward. Augusta got 4 new students in March alone, 2 sisters named Becker and a boy named Alejandro Vega, whose family had come up from Texas, and who spoke English with the particular precision of someone who has learned it carefully and was still calibrating its oddities. She loved her work in the spring. The longer days meant more light for reading. The warmth meant she could take the class outside sometimes, which improved everyone's mood, including hers. She had been in Cassidy Creek over a year now, and it had settled into her the way a place settles when you stop wondering if it is permanent and start knowing it is. This was her town, these were her people, this was her ground. Reuben came to her in March with a different kind of look on his face, the look of a man who has made a decision and is about to say so. They were at the creek, walking on the early spring afternoon, the water running bright and cold beside them, and she had been talking about Alejandro Vega's impressive progress with long division when he stopped walking. She stopped too. "I've been talking to Weston Briggs," he said. Weston Briggs was a landowner whose property sat 3 miles south of town, on good water with good grass, and who was getting old and had no children, and had been talking for 2 years about selling to someone who would work it right. Augusta looked at him carefully. "And he's willing to sell," Reuben said. "The price is right. I have most of what I need, and Briggs is willing to take the rest over 2 years. He stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. He looked at her with an expression she could only describe as vulnerable, which on a face as generally composed as his was arresting. "But I'm not going to do it if you're not part of the plan. I'm not buying land for one, Augusta. I have not been thinking about it for one." The creek ran past them, high and cold and relentless. A hawk called from somewhere above. The spring air smelled of wet earth and new grass. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "Because if you are, Reuben Conroy, you should probably say so directly." "I'm asking you to marry me," he said directly. "I'm asking if you want to build something with me on that land, something that's ours. I know it won't be easy. I know the first years will be hard work, but I can't imagine building it with anyone else, and I don't want to try." She looked at him standing there in the spring light, this steady, careful, honest man who had appeared in her life through a broken lantern and a wet storm and a waltz and had been, she understood now, exactly what she had come west to find without knowing she was looking. "Yes," she said. "Reuben, yes." He crossed the distance between them and took her face in both his hands, those large, careful hands, and kissed her with the full weight of everything he had been carrying toward this moment. And the creek ran past them, and the hawk called again, and the spring pressed in from all sides, green and insistent and full of everything that was coming. They told Harriet Doone that same evening, and Harriet cried, which surprised Augusta and clearly surprised Harriet herself, who seemed mildly annoyed by her own tears. They told Reverend Crane, who said the words providential and testimony in the same sentence, which was very much on brand for Reverend Crane. Frank Henderson shook Reuben's hand, and his wife Ellen pressed Augusta's both in both of hers and said she was so very glad, with the simple warmth of someone who meant it entirely. The wedding was in May, in the schoolhouse that doubled as a church, because where else would Augusta Fletcher be married but in the place that had been the center of her life in this town? She wore her blue dress, the better one, taken in at the waist and with new ribbon at the collar that Harriet had insisted on, and Augusta had agreed to because sometimes other people's happiness about your happiness was its own kind of gift. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Reuben had found and clearly spent some time putting together, which she could tell because some of them were slightly mismatched in a way that suggested he had found each one separately rather than in a pre-assembled bunch. She told him this quietly before the ceremony in the small anteroom behind the altar. "I'm not a florist," he said. "No," she agreed. "You're better. You picked these yourself." He looked at her in her blue dress with the new ribbon and the wildflowers, and something in his face went soft and certain all at once, and he said, "I'm the luckiest man in this territory." "We're both lucky," she said. "Don't you think?" "Yeah," he said, and he was smiling again, the real one, the one that changed his face. "Yeah, I do." The ceremony was short and real and full of the particular dignity of two people making promises they actually intended to keep, which was the only kind of promise that dignified a ceremony. Otis Birch played the fiddle outside afterward, mostly in tune this time, and there was food and dancing and the whole town came, or it felt like it, and Augusta danced with her husband for the first time and thought, "There it is. There is the thing I did not know I was looking for." They moved to the Briggs land in June, which required negotiation with Harriet Doone, who was theoretically Augusta's employer and practically her friend, about what the arrangement would look like now that Augusta was living 3 miles out of town. They worked out that Augusta would continue teaching through the school year, that the school would need to find additional help as the student roll grew, and that this was going to require the town to start thinking seriously about its educational infrastructure, which was a conversation Augusta had been trying to start for 6 months anyway. Harriet said she would take it to the town council. Augusta said she would hold her to it. The land was good land. Reuben had known it, which was part of why he had wanted it, and Augusta walked it in the long June evenings and found herself moved by it in a way she had not been moved by any place she had lived. It was the way the light lay on the grass in the late afternoon, flat and golden, the way the creek ran through the south pasture with a sound that you could hear from the house if the wind was right, the way the sky above it was so big that standing under it you understood, viscerally and completely, what Reuben had meant when he said he came west for space. The house on the Briggs property was not grand, but it was solid, built to last in the way that practical people built things, and they spent the first weeks making it their own with the small acts of claiming a space. Her books on the shelf, his tools hung in the barn in his particular order, a garden plot marked out behind the kitchen that she would plant in the spring, the good cast iron stove moved from her old house in town because she was not leaving it behind. She hung curtains in the front windows, blue ones, and he raised an eyebrow and she said, "What?" And he said, "Nothing," with the smile that was becoming one of her favorite things in the world. He bought cattle in July, 15 head good stock from a reliable seller out of Abilene, and spent the summer learning the rhythms of managing his own land rather than someone else's, which was a different kind of work. He was good at it. She watched him in it and was proud in a way she had not expected to be, a specific pride in seeing someone find their shape. She was still teaching. She rode to town 3 times a week in the fall, when the new school year started, and on the days she did not teach, she worked on the land beside him, or managed the house, or wrote the letters, and kept the accounts with the same meticulous attention she gave her grade books. They worked hard and the work was real, and sometimes it was exhausting, and sometimes it was frustrating, and always, at the end of the day, they sat at the table in the kitchen where the lantern burned and they talked and ate and were together, and that was enough. That was more than enough. November came again, a year after all of it had begun, and Augusta stood one afternoon in the kitchen looking at the lantern on the table, the same one she had bought at Hatcher's General Store the morning after the first one broke, the brass-fitted one with the weighted base, and she thought about everything that had led from that lantern to this kitchen to this life. She was still looking at it when Reuben came in from the barn, knocking mud from his boots at the door, and he came into the kitchen and saw her looking at the lantern and stopped. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About lanterns," she said. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the lantern too, as if it were worth the looking, and she thought, "This is what I love about him. He never ridicules the things I look at. He just looks with me." "You know," she said, "the night I dropped the old one and went to buy this one, I had no idea." She turned to look at him. "I had absolutely no idea what that lantern was going to be part of." He put his arm around her shoulders, her husband with his mud boots and his careful hands and his honest face. "I had some idea," he said. She looked up at him. "Did you?" "Maybe not about all of it," he said, "but I saw you standing there in Hatcher's store holding that lantern and thinking about it as if it actually mattered, and I thought." He paused. "What?" she said. I thought that was a woman who takes things seriously, who sees what's worth seeing. He looked down at her. I thought I wanted to know you better, just from watching me hold a lantern, she said. You were very thoughtful about it, he said, and she laughed and leaned into him, and the lantern burned steadily on the table, doing what it had always done, making the dark manageable, making the inside warm. She told him in December, on a quiet evening when the first real snow of the season was falling past the windows, with the particular gentleness that December snow has when you are watching it from inside somewhere warm. She had been sure for 2 weeks, and she had spent those 2 weeks sitting with the certainty of it, holding it carefully, like something made of very good glass. She took his hands across the table and told him. The expression that crossed his face was not something she had words for. It was not simple happiness, though happiness was certainly in it. It was the expression of a man encountering something so significant that his whole face had to rearrange itself to accommodate it, and in the rearranging she could see all of it. The joy and the gravity and the love and the weight of a future suddenly made very specific. Augusta, he said. I know, she said. We're going to have a baby, he said, as if he needed to say it aloud to make it real. We are, she said. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood up too, and he held her. Not dramatically, just held her. His arms around her and her face against his chest, and the snow falling past the window and the lantern on the table. And they stood there for a long time in the kitchen that was theirs on the land that was theirs. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing necessary to say, and some moments are complete exactly as they are. She stopped riding to town for teaching in February, when the cold made the trip difficult and the pregnancy made long days harder. And Harriet Doone had, as promised, found an assistant teacher, a young woman named Pearl Sims who had come to town the previous autumn and who had 2 years of schooling experience from Missouri. Augusta handed over her classroom with the particular combination of pride and grief that comes from releasing something you have built, and she went home to the Conroy land and turned her attention to the preparing. She made things with her hands all through those winter months, the way her mother had made things, the sewing kit still in its box on the shelf, and she thought about her mother with a warmth that was no longer just grief, had become something else, something that included grief but was not only it. She thought her mother would have liked Reuben. She thought her mother would have liked this kitchen, this land, this life. The baby came in late March, when the ground was just beginning to soften and the first green was showing along the creek. Ellen Henderson was there, as she had offered to be, and Harriet Doone made the 3-mile trip despite the mud and stood in the kitchen being fiercely calm in the way that women are fierce and calm for each other when it matters. Reuben was in the house, because Augusta had told him flatly that she was not going to do this with him pacing in the barn like a spectator, and he stayed in the front room while it happened, close enough to hear her when she needed him. The baby was a boy, born in the mid-morning when the light was good, and he arrived with the decisive conviction of a person who has somewhere to be. He was healthy and loud about it, and when Reuben came in and Harriet Doone put the wrapped baby in his arms, Augusta watched her husband's face do the rearranging again, the same one as December but larger, deeper, the expression of a man holding his son for the first time. "Hello," Reuben said to the baby quietly as if introducing himself to someone important. "He needs a name," Augusta said from the bed, exhausted and radiant and completely herself. "I know," Reuben said. He was still looking at the baby. "I was thinking Thomas, if you like it." And then, with the awareness she always loved in him, not just for Thomas Henderson, though that's not a bad reason. "It was my grandfather's name. He was a good man." "Thomas," Augusta said, trying it. "Thomas Conroy." "Thomas James Conroy," Reuben said. "James was your father's name." She had told him that, months ago over dinner in passing, the way you tell things to the person you are telling everything to. She had not known he was keeping it. "Thomas James Conroy," she said, and something in her chest broke open the good way, the way that makes you larger rather than smaller. "Yes, that's his name. They named him well and raised him well, and the land around them grew into something real and good in the years that followed. Reuben bought more cattle in the second year and added horses in the third. And by the fourth year the Conroy property was one of the better-regarded small ranches in the county, not the biggest but the most carefully managed, which was a distinction that mattered to people who knew what they were looking at. Augusta returned to teaching when Thomas was old enough to come with her on the days she went to town, and she watched Pearl Sims with the critical eye of a good mentor and the warm eye of someone who was glad her work had continued in her absence and was glad to take it back. The town of Cassidy Creek grew, as Kansas towns grew in the 1880s, adding a proper bank and a second mercantile and a doctor who stayed, finally, instead of just passing through. The railroad came to the county, though not directly through Cassidy Creek, which was a disappointment to some and a relief to others. Augusta counted herself in the latter group without apology. The arguments she had had with herself in her first years about the injustices of westward expansion did not resolve themselves, because they were not the kind of injustices that resolved themselves through individual moral clarity. But she said the true things when she could and taught her students to think with honest eyes, and she believed, even when she was not sure it was enough, that it was something. She and Reuben argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong opinions about things and they were spending their lives in close proximity. And an argument with Reuben Conroy was a particular experience because he never raised his voice, but he did not back down from what he believed either. And Augusta had been known to do both, which made the balance interesting. They always found their way back, because they had started honestly and the foundation held. They had a second child 3 years after Thomas, a girl they named Clara, who from her first breath seemed to have her father's steadiness, and her mother's absolute refusal to accept the premise of anything she disagreed with, which Reuben said was a challenging combination, and Augusta said was a wonderful one. Clara grew up knowing how to ride before she learned to read, and learned to read before most children her age, and had opinions about everything by the time she was 4, which was a source of immense secret pride to both her parents and only occasional exasperation. Thomas, at 5, was already showing the naturalist tendency that had apparently been distributed by the universe to all 9-year-old boys in Cassidy Creek, because he was constantly bringing home specimens, feathers and stones, and once, memorably, a small snake. And Reuben handled these with the equanimity of a man who had decided that raising children meant accepting that your house was going to contain things you did not personally invite. Augusta held the snake without flinching and examined it with Thomas and told him its species, which she had read about. And Thomas looked at her with the pure love that children have for the person who takes their interests seriously. One afternoon in the fall, when Thomas was 6 and Clara was 3, Augusta was in the kitchen in the late afternoon light, and she went to light the lantern as the dark came in, the same lantern, the brass-fitted one from Hatcher's General Store, which had been with her through all of it and still burned clean. She struck the match and lit it and set it on the table, and the warm circle of its light fell across the kitchen floor. And Reuben came in from outside with Clara on his shoulders and Thomas at his heels, and the light caught all 3 of them in the doorway, her family, and she stood at the table with the lit lantern, and felt something so complete, it was almost impossible to hold. Reuben put Clara down and she ran to Augusta, and Augusta picked her up, and Reuben looked across the kitchen at his wife holding their daughter in the lamplight, and she knew from his face that he was feeling something close to the same thing. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. "Better now." Thomas was already pulling off his boots and telling her about a bird he had seen near the South Creek, a species he did not recognize. And she listened with her full attention, because that was what you did for people you loved. You gave them your full attention when they offered you what mattered to them. Clara was tugging on her collar and saying something about wanting to help with dinner, which she always said, and which always resulted in more supervision than actual help, and which Augusta always allowed. Reuben washed his hands at the basin and came to stand beside her at the table where she was now setting Clara down on the bench, and he kissed the top of her head, Augusta's head, the way he did at the end of the day, quietly and as if it were simply part of the day's necessary activities. "There's something I want to tell you," he said, low enough that it was between them. "Tell me," she said. "I was thinking, riding back today," he said, "about how this all started." She looked at him. "The lantern," she said. He smiled. "I saw you in Hatcher's store that morning holding it, and I thought I should say something useful. I should have a reason to talk to her." A pause. "I should have just said I wanted to talk to her." "You were getting there," she said. "I was getting there slowly," he said. "You always did," she said, "and everything you said was worth waiting for." He looked at her with that look, the one she had been seeing for years now and that had not once in all that time become ordinary, the look that said, "You are the most true thing I have found in this world." "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time they had said it, and it was not the last, and it was not diminished by repetition but deepened, the way things deepen when they are returned to again and again, and find the same thing waiting. Outside, the Kansas evening was falling across the flat land, and the sky was going the spectacular colors that a prairie sky goes at day's end, orange and pink and the deep, wordless blue of approaching dark. The creek ran in the south pasture. The cattle were settled for the night. The horses stood quiet in the barn. Thomas had moved on from the bird and was now asking about dinner with the directness of a 6-year-old who has filed away all interesting information and now requires fuel. And Clara was telling him that she had helped Augusta cook dinner, which she had not, which was a statement of aspiration rather than fact. And Reuben put his arm around Augusta's shoulders, and they stood together in the kitchen of their house on their land, and the lantern on the table burned the way it had always burned. Steady and clean, making the dark manageable, making the inside warm. The years that followed wrote themselves in the particular language of a life well built. Seasons on good land, children growing into themselves with the confidence of people who had been taken seriously from the beginning. A town that changed and grew around them while they remained one of its constants. A marriage that deepened not in spite of but because of the hard days and the disagreements and the exhaustion, and all the unglamorous ordinary work that love actually is when you commit to it honestly. Thomas Conroy, at 12, won a county writing competition with an essay about the migratory patterns of raptors in Kansas, which he had been observing and noting in a journal his mother had given him. He read it aloud at the school, with the careful seriousness of someone who means every word, and Augusta sat in the back of the room and did not allow herself to cry mostly. Clara Conroy, at 9, decided she was going to be a doctor and announced this at dinner with the finality of someone who has considered all arguments and found them insufficient. Reuben looked at Augusta across the table. Augusta looked at Reuben. They did not say anything discouraging, because they were not people who said discouraging things to their children about what was possible. What they said was that she would need to study very hard, and that the path would be difficult but that it had been done before, and that she should begin with her reading and work her way forward from there. Clara said she knew. She had already planned it, and went back to eating her dinner with the composure of someone who has settled the matter. Augusta continued teaching until Thomas was 13, at which point she shifted to a part-time arrangement that let her manage the ranch accounts and help with the land in the ways that the ranch increasingly needed as it grew, and Pearl Sims, who had turned into an excellent full teacher in her own right, took over the full class. Augusta did not grieve this transition, or not much. She had given a great deal to the school, and she had received a great deal from it, and she knew when a chapter had reached its natural end. She walked the land instead, in the mornings before the day fully started, the way she had walked the creek path in the early days of the courtship, learning its geography. The Conroy land knew her by now. She knew where the water table ran close to the surface in the south field, where the grass grew thickest in the east pasture, which fence line needed mending every spring no matter how well they patched it in the fall. She knew this land the way you know a thing you have chosen and committed to, which is differently from the way you know anything that happened to you without your choosing. One October morning, she was at her kitchen table, the morning light coming through the blue curtains, which had been replaced once and would need replacing again, and she was writing a letter to her cousin in Ohio, who had married and had children and wrote with the regularity of someone who believes that family is maintained through correspondence. She was describing the fall, the way the light came across the flat land and set the dry grass gold, the way the sky was full of the southward migration that Thomas had been tracking all week with his notebook. She was describing her husband and her children and the life they had built, and she was aware, writing it, of an enormous gratitude that had no single object but spread across everything. Across the lantern on the table that still burned clean, across the man outside whose voice she could hear talking to the horses in the barn, across the children who were somewhere on the property being themselves, with the full conviction of people who had been given room to figure out what that meant. She finished the letter and went to the door and looked out at the morning. Reuben was coming across the yard from the barn, his hat on, his coat open against the October cold that was not yet serious. He looked up and saw her in the doorway and raised one hand, the simple acknowledgement of a man who sees his wife and is glad too. She raised her hand back. Then she went inside and lit the lantern, though it was morning and there was light enough from the windows, because she wanted to. Because the lantern had been there since the beginning and she liked what it stood for, the warm, steady thing that had started everything, that had been, in its way, the first small light in the darkness of what she did not yet know was coming toward her. The flame took and burned clean, and the kitchen was warm, and outside her husband was crossing the yard toward her, and the Kansas sky above the flat land was the particular blue of an October morning that knows it will not last but is glorious in the time it has. This was the life. This, exactly, was the life. It was real and hard and beautiful and hers, and she had chosen it with both hands, and she would choose it again, 1,000 times over, without hesitation, because choosing it truly was the best thing she had ever done. The lantern burned on the table in the warm kitchen of the Conroy house on the Conroy land, and Augusta Fletcher Conroy stood at the stove starting the morning coffee, and the door opened and Reuben came in bringing the cold air and the smell of horses and the solid, steady fact of himself. And she turned to look at him, her husband, and he looked at her, his wife, and between them was everything that a lantern and a broken night and a storm and a waltz and an honest question at a creek had made. Which was this life, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything?